Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. Some major developments have taken place in the Ukraine war. Analysis of the kind of battles that are taking place within that country have driven much discussion around the world. I have with me Lieutenant General Shokin Chauan, an avid, strategist and a thinker who's been actually guiding me through with regards various strategic moves that each one of those countries are making during the Ukraine war. Thank you, sir, for joining me. There are certain articles that we want to discuss. One was the Rusi article, and the second one where the United Kingdom military chief talks about the entire changing urban and land warfare.
Yeah, very interesting. Both of them very interesting articles. And the West is finally actually looking at their propaganda that they had unleashed when Russia started the war. And 4 months into the war, almost 5 months now, they have realized that their propaganda didn't succeed because it merely made the Western narrative unacceptable to the people at large. So when you are planning a narrative or when you're planning a propaganda war or an information warfare operations, you have to make sure that everything that you take out is believable. And when the narrative becomes unbelievable, you just lose the narrative anyway because people stop believing you. Which is the reason why it's important for us to understand that when you're preparing a narrative for the information warfare situation, every aspect of what you say has to be believable, and that issue is actually the problem all over.
Indeed, sir. Sir, I'd like to open this discussion by asking you something which I find to be a little weird, is the factor that every time this war is discussed, it's all about very tactical battles, very tactical situations. The Snake Island thing happened and this and that. Everybody's talking about one city here, one city there and stuff like that. But the overall strategic, analysis of this particular battle and the impact that it's making is somewhere that we find, completely missing. How do you find this whole missing link? Is it purposeful? How do you analyze this whole situation?
See, Adi, the issue is like this, that the whole battle was fought on a particular premise. We've discussed this often, actually, both you and me have discussed this particular thing often. The premise was the fact that Ukraine would probably give up immediately. That was, after all, Russia had taken Crimea, they had carried out a series of other operations, but they didn't face any problem. They didn't face any opposition. So probably the Russian leadership felt that if they attacked Ukraine would probably surrender immediately and give in to whatever Russia was planning for them. But that didn't happen, Adi. It didn't happen because NATO decided that they would fight this war till the last Ukrainian. That means two issues happened. They sold Ukrainians a narrative, and that's the narrative that's even continuing till today, that you can one day win this war. A couple of days back, I read Admiral Stavridis' article on how Ukraine can and will win this war over a protracted period of time. Because what he said was that the Russian casualties have been prohibitive, up to 50,000 people dead, and a huge loss of AFBs and a huge loss of weapon systems and a huge loss of aircrafts. The Russian narrative of having lost, and no country gives out the number of people they lose, but is about 1/6 of the US and the UK. Think that about 50, 60,000. The Ukrainians, of course, say the Russians have lost up to 100,000. So when you have a huge difference between 100,000, 50,000, and the Russians saying we've lost probably 6 to 8,000, you have to take a figure in between. But even 10 or 12 or 15,000 people casualties, soldiers casualties, is a very large number for a underpopulated country like Russia. So the first premise was that Ukraine would give up. Ukraine didn't give up because NATO decided and told them this thing that you can win this war. The Russians, after the first month of realizing that, either realizing or had planned this, that this part we will have to leave for history to decide, you know, uh, whether the Russians planned this particular thing or didn't plan it. Uh, that means they kept a sizable force in Belarus, a sizable force to show an attack towards Kiev, and tied up a large force of the Ukrainian army to protect Kiev. Whereas the Russians actually maybe had planned only operations in the south. So as a result, this ruse succeeded because their attacks in the south and the taking over of the Donbass region, the area that is intrinsically Russian in nature, or Russian speaking people have a majority in the Donbass region. The Russians didn't get much opposition there. So maybe it was a ruse that they kept this large force there, kept a large number of Ukrainian forces stuck up there, and then used the balance of the forces from the south and came in and took over the southern regions from Crimea to the Sea of Azov completely, taking over the Black Sea, as well as taking over all Russian speaking areas, both in the south and the east. And that's a largish area. It's larger than many countries in Europe. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, and they've taken a sizable amount of place. And the amount of opposition has not been much for two reasons. One, the Ukrainian armed forces themselves are largely disorganized and had kept kept at least the south part of it to the Azov battalion too, or the Azov unit to try and protect. But the Azov unit finally gave up in that siege of the factory. The second issue was that either that was a ruse by Russia, or it was a plan, saying that if that doesn't succeed, then our plan B would be this. So this second part of what they have done over the last 2 months, Adi, of slowly and not putting too much force into a pitched battle, using their artillery, long-range artillery, their cruise missiles, and their standoff weapon systems to create these corridors, whereby they've been able to take over large amounts of built-up area, large amount of towns, large amount of cities in the south and the east, without suffering too many casualties or without putting too much forces into the battlefield. So when you talk of strategic forces and you talk of tactical battles, I am not sure whether the strategic part of Russia's plan was to fight smaller tactical battles without committing their main force. In the article by the Land Force Commander of the UK, he talks exactly of this, that Russia did not commit its forces mainly because they were not fighting the NATO. They're fighting Ukraine. And they're pretty clear about the Ukraine armed forces capabilities. So this is the reason why people talk about just tactical battles, because strategically, the larger forces have not maneuvered in Ukraine at all. They have been kept ready in the north. They're still in Belarus. They haven't entered that 60-mile convoy that was supposed to enter Kiev, whom the Russians, the Americans, and the NATO countries had said had got stuck up, could have could well have been just a ruse that they tied up everything to take whatever they've taken. And today, Putin has found a happy balance of not committing forces into battle,
Mhm.
of his keeping the pot boiling by using artillery. Now, you also have to, study Adi. What is the kind of weapon system that he's using here? Russians, are you aware, have used artillery as their force multiplier. It's actually used at the border war. They used artillery to box in the Ukrainian forces, to destroy them, to move them from a particular point. And what kind of weapon systems are they using? They're using World War II pieces. They're using post World War pieces, for which they have no shortage of ammunition. So it's literally Ukraine and parts of the areas that they're targeting. They are using Ukraine like a field firing range. They target an area, they've got a lot of ammunition, they keep moving off that ammunition, firing in those particular areas. And there is no way, regardless of the amount of artillery, the HIMAR pieces that Ukraine's getting, there's no way they can counter that kind of bombardment from what the Russians are doing. And if you notice, no one's talking of Russian casualties now because they're not committing anyone into battle. When they go into a particular city, they've destroyed it totally. So there has to be a point, Adi, at which the Ukrainian people or Zelensky will realize the unacceptable loss to his country. And at that time, start direct peace talks with Putin and maybe accept what Putin has to say. Because either you save your country and your people, or you go back 100 years. So that seems to be the issue, Adi. And that seems to be the reason why we're seeing no large strategic maneuvers.
When you look at it like that and the way you described it, I couldn't. This one thought couldn't escape me that the tactical nature of analysis of this battle and a primary focus on Kiev actually gave the Russians a very clear strategic advantage. Nobody was bothering looking south or east or anywhere else, and they just did what they needed to. And that is very interesting, sir. Uh, I'd like to ask you about the beginning part of the battle. So everybody expected a huge attack in terms of hybrid warfare and various elements that particular kind of warfare would carry. Uh, Probably the only thing that we see happening on ground is the Starlink, and that came out to be a very clear distinction because the Russians basically targeted GPS systems of the Ukrainians. Starlink came and helped them out, and they're pretty much back on. And post which we've not seen that kind of hybrid attacks taking place. How do you foresee the future of hybrid warfare in kinetic operations, sir?
Okay. Let's just analyze this word hybrid for the benefit of our viewers. Hybrid means basically utilizing a large number of different forces to create a larger point of attack. That means you use cyber forces, you use fifth generation warfare, that means irregular warfare, you use special forces and bring them all together for a common task. That would be the hybrid kind of war that we are planning on. So here, when the Russians targeted the GPS systems and Elon Musk brought in the Starlink, that's just one part of an issue of what they otherwise have lost. You can't cyber your way across the river. You can't cyber a urban warfare battle. That part the Ukrainians have simply been not been doing at all. The Ukrainians don't use have no advantage of the air. The Russians own the air of the battlefield. There is no place at which the Ukrainian Air Force has ever been successful, regardless of the ghost of Kiev that was supposed to have knocked out 30, 40 Russian MiGs. The second issue is that when you have this control, you have also control over what is in the air.
Mhm.
You have the drones that the Ukrainians had bought from Turkey. Those drones uh, have proved to be largely ineffective because the Russians have jammed all frequencies and otherwise blasted these drones out because Russian air defense is fabulous. So you don't hear about them at all because Russians have not let these drones operate. An odd video of Russian tanks being destroyed has been circulated again and again and again. But in the larger part of this battle, and after, if you remember the Armenian War, the Azerbaijan Armenian War, when we thought that the drones were now the singular weapon of war, the Russians have simply outmaneuvered the drones by owning the air, by owning the cyber, by owning all the other issues to prevent Ukraine from using any other part of this warfare, the hybrid war. The last part of the hybrid war was using fifth generation warfare. That means using irregulars to fight in the cities, to give pitched battles and to destroy Russian army or Russian troops as they entered the towns and cities, urban warfare, right? Uh, that the Russians have overcome by using artillery, standoff weapons. So before they enter a town, they don't they don't enter it at all. They enter it after it's absolutely destroyed. Then what are the 5GW warriors or the citizen soldiers who guided there to protect these areas? What are they protecting now? Those Molotov cocktails that Zelensky had made, and it came in the media that they were preparing these Molotov cocktails for the Russian army to come in, have all been overcome by this immense bombardment that Putin has done, or the Russian army has done in the south and the east.
Mhm.
So, hybrid warfare is probably only fought when you have an equal level of armed forces. In this case, the Ukrainian forces are probably 1/10 or 1/15 of the capability of the Russian forces. And regardless of the kind of weapon systems that the NATO might give them, eventually two things have to be clear, and it has to be clear to us also, Adi, that in any war in the future, you will be fighting alone. You might get moral support, you might get logistic support, but the battle is yours to fight and win.
Absolutely.
So, Russians have destroyed the issue about the NATO's capability of preventing a war. And that was something that held peace, Adi, from the Second World War onwards. That an alliance of nations get together to prevent war, that has been destroyed by the Russians.
You've basically laid waste to the entire foundation of NATO, then, sir.
Absolutely. And that is the basis upon which we must look at, at planning and thinking about the lessons that we're going to draw from India is going to draw from the Russian-Ukraine war. That in battle and in an alliance with Pakistan and China, if they attack us, we are essentially alone.
Absolutely.
And we should not expect any other country to help us. Maximum would be uh, words of comfort.
Indeed, sir.
So we have to be clear, and this is what Russians have shown, that look, if they decide that this is the way they're going to fight their war, then this is the way the war can be prosecuted, and it can be prosecuted despite the entire world against you. Because when a superpower is fighting, you're going to be very clear and very careful about putting boots on the ground. So that is the lesson that comes out, the strategic lesson, tactical lesson, that you have to, a country has to plan for fighting on its own.
I think this is a very hard hitting answer, if I may say so, sir. Because the NATO question that you've put across is a very interesting one and needs a little bit more of a pondering and some understanding. Having said that, sir, warfare, as a matter of fact, has always now been considered to be a blitzkrieg method. When it's discussed, it is always like, okay, the army will run through a certain place and capture it and this and that. Um, Firstly, why is that considered to be the norm of warfare in terms of uh, a modern combat? And do you think, in your opinion, that is the smartest way of fighting in urban combat, as what we were just discussing?
Adi, we talked about this earlier too. I would, as a military leader, avoid towns and cities. I would not go inside. Blitzkrieg is a strategic maneuver to move quickly using a combined arms force to outmaneuver the defensive forces.
Mm.
And that's why Blitzkrieg got its name from the German prosecution of war in the Second World War, when they outmaneuvered the Maginot Line by entering France through the rest of Europe, to Belgium, or to enter, the other countries. Blitzkrieg was that they entered your rear areas without striking the Maginot Line. Yes, another very important premise that we used to keep talking about in the army was a swift war, because uh, the world alliance would stop you from fighting. It's been 5 months and the Russians have not stopped fighting.
Yeah.
So that's another concept that has been torn in tatters.
Mm-hmm. That's
The
one of
first
the
one
reasons I asked this
was
question.
that an alliance does not prevent war. And the second is that you need not plan for a blitzkrieg. You need not plan for a short and swift war. You can plan for a small, continuous battle like the Russians are planning, provided you have the kind of weapon systems,
Mm-hmm.
the ammunition, the logistics that the Russians are capable of bringing onto the battlefield. So there are many, many lessons that we must study the Ukraine war from. And the most important issue is, where are we in this war? Are we neutral? Are we drawing any lessons out of this? Are we planning anything better? So these are issues that we would have to face. These are answers we would have to face, because we face a very formidable weapon enemy in China and Pakistan together.
I want to go to the logistics and especially of the ammunition, sir. But before that, I'm going to just drag this a little bit longer by asking you a simple question. Modern combat, in terms of urban combat, and what you're looking at today that the Russians are doing, is a slow grinding process in terms of doing, and the way you're describing it in terms of encircling the Ukrainians, pounding them into submission, and just walking into a city after that. That's what they seem to be doing with their long range artillery and so on and so forth. So what comes out is firepower seems to be ruling the game. How would you comment on that, sir?
Actually, we should have expected this. For those of us who read the Second World War and studied it, the Battle of Britain, Battle of Berlin, the manner in which the Russians advanced in the last year, that was between August 44 to May 45, was using similar tactics. They laid to waste all German cities, destroyed them entirely, and they went in with their forces only after they destroyed them. That's the way the Russians prosecute war. We were fitting the Russian narrative into our perception of how battle should be fought. That didn't happen. So, once again, I say that you can do this if you have that kind of equipment that Russia has. And if you've got the kind of stockpile of weapons and ammunition that you have, that this kind of war can also be fought and won. So, at what point would Ukraine, say that, look, now this is it, let's stop the war?
That's the line.
What is that point of culmination? Point of culmination that will bring Putin to say, okay, I've achieved my aims and I stop the war. Till then, this continues. But if you notice, there have been no large scale maneuvers, no movement of the Russian army. It's just constant artillery bombardment, slowly using artillery 50,000, 60,000 shells a day, destroying important infrastructure, as well as the will of the population to prosecute, to fight this war.
That is what I want to come to the next, sir. You talk about 50, 60,000 shells a day, and this is apart from uh, missiles, rockets, hand fired stuff, air power. This is just artillery. Now, the Financial Times, some time ago, so I had done this and I had shared this article with you. If people want, I'll put the link in the description as well. Says, and I'd like to just read out here, the total annual US production of 155 millimeter artillery shells, for example, would last less than 2 weeks of combat in Ukraine. Now, this, as I said, I picked up from the Financial Times. Uh, the same is the case with France and the UK, who have been supplying, weapons to Ukraine, who have come out and said that they will not be able to last any further deliveries. Uh, if they do any further deliveries, it will result in a deterioration of their own fighting power, which probably would have happened in certain countries like Canada, which has come out and said it. The narrative still is that the Russians have been, pulling out microchips from washing machines and old TVs, and they've been running out of rockets and missiles for the past 5 months. And in the past 15 days, there have been more than 370 major missile attacks that have taken place in Ukraine. How do you put this entire thing in perspective in terms of the industrial warfare that Russia is fighting, sir?
So that just shows how wrong NATO was in its assessment of Russia's capabilities. When the intelligence gives you an idea that Russians are pulling out the microchips from washing machines, it means that Russians are on their last legs of, but it hasn't happened. So obviously the Russians have stockpiled weapon systems, they've stockpiled ammunition, and they're nowhere near giving up, and they're nowhere near finding that point of culmination. So I feel Russia can continue in this manner, maybe for another 3-4 months, and by then every NATO country would have, the supplies would have finished. I don't think we have been able to, assess Russia's capabilities. Like I said, Adi, it's very important for us to understand that when we put out a narrative in information warfare, that narrative has to be believable. This narrative that was put out by NATO was simply unbelievable. And that is why no one today believes them. No one takes it seriously. No one takes the US or the UK assessment of war seriously. In fact, I'm certain that your videos on Ukraine get greater traction and have greater believability than the interview being taken out by the generals of the US Army or the UK Army. Which is why we find this lecture in Brucey, which is why we find the chief of the land force commanders of the UK finally accepting this particular issue. That maybe time to start speaking the truth. Maybe it's time to start telling uh, telling the Ukraine that look, lost the war, now start fighting this peace so that you get a better deal. After a while, it will be impossible.
So that's a very interesting revelation that you put across in terms of underestimation of capacities. Now, I'd like to ask you a simple question before I come to the lessons that India can learn in terms of what we've discussed today. India faces two challenges on its western and northeastern front. One is a more urbanized combat in terms of Pakistan, desert, urban sort of a scenario. And the second is a diametrically opposite mountain scenario. Uh, the Russians, on the other hand, if you compare it, their threat is a more of a urban, land, plain sort of a war system. And they've adapted themselves according to that. Looking at this particular situation, do you see a change that the Indian Army or the Indian Armed Forces is bringing it into its game? Do you see certain lessons being learnt already with certain things being put into focus?
Yes, of course, Adi. We're learning lessons very quickly. Like I said, the first lesson that India as a country must learn that we will fight this war alone. That's the first issue. That if we think that we can depend on the Quad, it is not possible. The Quad can only give us moral support. Can be no help by boots on the ground. Alliances, especially loose alliances like the Quad or like NATO or these other countries, mean very little for a superpower, which has the capability of hitting you as well as protecting itself. So the first lesson that India must look at is that it's on its own. If you're fighting in the mountains, I don't think there's any country more experienced in the mountains than India is. The mountain warfare or the warfare in Ladakh essentially is is a kind of warfare of vital areas and vital points. It's like a land desert. It's at a great height, above 11, 12,000 feet, but it's eventually a land desert. You have to find out two things here: is what is the enemy's culmination point? Where does the enemy think he can reach by fighting a war there? And once you've been able to analyze the enemy's point, that where are they reaching and what do they want out of this war, can we actually plan to prevent that particular thing? So the first issue of what we're doing is we're holding the line. We have put in, we have mirrored the Chinese deployment. We have enough reserves to fight the Chinese in Ladakh, as well as in Arunachal Pradesh or any point in the northeast. We are capable of fighting a defensive war with an ability using our strike forces to carry out a riposte in case we require. With Pakistan, this warfare bit, the terrain of this war is from the mountains of Kargil, coming downwards to the lower hills of Kashmir, and finally the desert of the Thar Desert, and finally onto the white sands of Gujarat. or Bhuj. So and of course Punjab. At each point, we are fairly strong about having the capability to deter the Pakistanis from coming in. Whether we have the capability of using our riposte forces or our strike forces against Pakistan is questionable because we've used a large amount of our reserves against China. But we have the ability to keep them at bay. We have the ability to ensure that we can do a lot of damage to them. And we are constantly analyzing this ability of both Pakistan and China to prosecute war and what exactly they want to do. So that's the issue. We are absolutely have learned a number of lessons. We must stockpile. We had earlier decreased our holding of ammunition. I think we must restart that holding of ammunition. Restart going back to a larger holding of ammunition. Well, that's the way this nature of mankind is. That's the way we'll have to protect ourselves.
I think that is one of the biggest points that these short-term wars that everybody talks about may or may not take place. I mean, the chances are that the world is pretty much helpless in stopping a particular conflict.
And probably the last issue is don't junk your old weapon systems.
Yeah,
they can come in useful elsewhere. We have a large number of old tanks, large number of old artillery pieces, which should not be junked. We should be kept in state of readiness. We should keep the ammunition with us, which we have stockpiled, because that can become useful to us at any point.
Final words.
That's the lesson I would go with, at any rate.
Sir, final words, sir. Where do you see this thing going forward? Because the Battle of Donbass seems to be, coming to a stop probably in a week, 10 days, or probably 2 weeks, if I'm any judge of the Russian maneuver in that region. Post which a lot of people are saying that the urbanized combat comes to pretty much a stop and it opens out into fields. Where do you see this entire thing going? Because the West is in no mood to kind of shut off the tap.
I think the Russians, the Western tap is more or less shut now. They've run out of their ability to support Ukraine. What I would feel if I was Putin or if I was his general, I would now be looking at hitting Kyiv from the forces I have in Belarus. Say in another month, I would be looking at further degrading the capital by moving again from the northeast towards Kyiv. The Russians, in the initial time also when we analyzed this war, Aadi, if you remember, we had looked at the Dnieper River as the division of Ukraine. I feel maybe Putin is still looking at that division of Ukraine till the Dnieper River. I think Putin feels that he can hold that part of Ukraine without a problem. So maybe they have another month or 2 months in the current way of fighting this war, of reaching the Dnieper River and closing on to the situation and cutting Ukraine into half. As it is, pre-1939 Ukraine existed only as a part of Poland, Poland, and Russia had the other. So I think the same issue might happen. They might have overdone what they thought they would get away with.
A lot has been said, sir, about the Russian efforts in Ukraine, and a lot has been written about it. In 5 years' time, I think when people or analysts will look back at what they've said and written, it'll be the judge of their own words, whether those things have actually come true. One thing that we have done, and I think we've done this multiple times in terms of the analysis of the Ukraine war, we've been pretty spot on in terms of whatever we've mentioned. We were right at the front when we said the Bharatkar TV2s are not going to work, and they didn't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we were right at the front to bring about the Battle of the East, and that's how it's being playing out. And that's what now we are saying, that it's the
And
point of
also
time.
bringing into focus the ruse that the Russians played
Absolutely, yes,
by
sir.
tying up a large number of Ukrainian forces in the northeast and simply not coming in.
It's quite a ruse. Nobody entered Ukraine for the next 2.5, 3 months. Nobody
Yeah.
wanted to even go there. So thank you so much, sir. It's always a pleasure talking to you, looking at
Thank you.
operational aspects of it from somebody who's actually been on the ground, planned for
Thank you.
such battles.
Thank you.
It's good to hear the analysis, and it's good to also understand the role a country can play for its armed forces to fight the battle, because it's also a battle of industries, and it's also a battle of supply chains and stuff like
Absolutely. Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
We kind of realize that. Thank you so much, sir.
Absolutely.
Till next time for
Thank
another
you.
interesting subject and analysis. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind. Thank you.